Awesome. Thank you so much, Carter, for having us. And I should say, I think we're all probably as marketers well qualified as behavioral scientists because we deal with humans and human decision making. So I'm super excited to be here and hopefully have a lively spirited conversation with all of you. I'm going to just kick it off, give you guys a little bit of background about myself, and then introduce you to behavioral science in case there are folks here that are not as familiar, just to make sure we all have a shared foundation of what behavioral science is, and then hoping that throughout our conversation, I can share more specific examples with you all so you can start thinking about how it can be relevant to the work that you're doing. So with that, just a little bit of background about me. So I actually started off my career not as a behavioral scientist or a marketeer for that fact, but more so as an engineer. And I worked in tech for a number of years before starting Next Step. And for a good chunk of our existence, we were largely a digital design creative agency. And it wasn't until a number of years ago where I actually kind of found the field of behavioral science myself. So at the time, my now husband was running a series of sleep medicine clinics nationwide, and they had the nation's highest adherence rates to these really difficult CPAP machines. I don't know if anybody's familiar with them. And I was just like really fascinated. I'm like, how do you get people to do that? They had like about an 80% adherence rate. And he shared the secret sauce, which is that he had basically found every single behavioral science book that he could find and was like systematically applying it in the business. So that really got me on my quest of trying to understand what is the field, what's happening. And since then, we now have really shifted our focus to being what I would call more of an applied behavioral science agency. And what that means is we do actual research in the real world, very much in the context of helping our clients with their marketing and product efforts. So largely figuring out how do you kind of motivate decisions in our clients' favors. And specific to that, I'd say we work with a variety of companies. We tend to work quite a bit with technology companies, and within that, we heavily focus on both B2B SaaS companies and fintech or traditional financial decision making. And largely where we're using behavioral science is what we find is with most of our clients, there's this kind of lack of clarity around what their users or prospects' real motivations and decision making is. And that basically bleeds into problems like not knowing exactly how do you increase your marketing adoption, or how do you reduce your customer acquisition cost, or how do you kind of reposition your brand for growth, or de-risk if you're trying to go after, say, a new vertical, a new market, et cetera. So these are kind of some of the common challenges that we kind of play with and work with our clients and help them solve. And I would say kind of the underlying theme that we find across of our clients is how are they viewing their users? And what we find, and this is a very natural, I should say, tendency that we have, is to think of our users as perfect like Spock. We're perfectly rational. And so if I simply give them more information about our solution and more choices in our product, Spock is a decision optimizer. He'll figure it out and he'll choose us. And in contrast, as behavioral scientists, we think of the prospect or the user lovingly, a little bit more like Homer Simpson. We all are faced with 35,000 decisions per day. I'm going to repeat that, 35,000 decisions per day. We're not running around making these decisions consciously. We have biases and mental shortcuts and heuristics and that really are involved in how we make decisions. And so when we start thinking about marketing, if we put that lens on how is Homer not always rational, it will help us find an additional way of thinking about solving the problem of how do we motivate Homer. And so I like to kind of give a little bit of a contrast of like, what we traditionally think of marketing. And, if you're thinking that your end user is Spock versus Homer, and as I mentioned, largely, we see this trend that we want to, especially with B2B marketing, we inadvertently include a lot of jargon and language that is not really clear to our audience. And in contrast, as behavioral scientists, we're always thinking about how can we make the end user feel like they're the expert. And we'll share some of these different principles as we go along. Or we have this tendency, like I mentioned, that we want to deliver more content because we believe that if people are well informed, they can make the optimal decision. And in contrast, as behavioral scientists, we say content is good, people do need to get informed, but it's really important that we understand their context. So what is the emotion that's motivating the decision making? And then finally, as B2B marketers, a lot of times we have this tendency to expect people to trust us because, very capable, we're best in our industry, et cetera. And in contrast, and especially in the economy that we're in, as behavioral scientists, we're really thinking about how do we radically reduce risk for people and remove uncertainty. And so there's a bunch of different principles that we use in this realm, which as we go along today, I'll hopefully cover. And then finally, with a lot of companies that we work with, especially tech companies, there's this desire to, if you're running tests and experiments, this idea to fail fast and hack your way to growth. And as behavioral scientists, we're thinking about, okay, how can we actually use this theory of human decision making, which is basically a body of over 300 or so research-backed principles that all show how do we deviate from rationality, and then how do we actually A/B test and run our experiments based on this, because really we're trying to uncover, again, what's that context, what's kind of motivating the decision making. So all of that to say, behavioral science, we like to say, is the study of how people really make decisions. And we kind of put that emphasis on the word really because we're taking into account things like people's emotions, how an environment is designed, whether it's digital or physical, social factors, all of these other factors that influence us as humans. Now, I want to just pause here. One thing that I find is helpful sometimes to kind of set context is to walk you guys through a quick example. So we get away from just theory and show you what does this all mean. I'm going to move to a quick example here. So this is kind of a common challenge that we see with our B2B clients. Largely, there's a desire to figure out how do we acquire more customers. So this specific client came to us because they were really successful in one sector and they were about to launch kind of this innovation solution that they had, and they had not done any research on their B2B buyers who are CIOs, chief innovation officers, CTOs, et cetera, in terms of trying to understand what's motivating the decision making. Also worth noting that their competitors were really well-known consultancies like the BCGs and McKinseys of the world. So what we ended up doing, we have sort of a 4-part process in terms of how we apply behavioral science to marketing, and I'll explain as we go. The first thing that we did was this thing called the behavioral science assessment, which is largely us looking at all the ways that they were currently marketing to the client. So that means looking at the websites, the landing pages, the ads, their sales decks, and et cetera. And one thing that we noticed that was really interesting to us, which intuitively makes sense, is they were marketing to audience based on this notion of hey, here are all the things that you can gain by choosing our solution. And if you think rationally about that, that makes a ton of sense because they're basically building these, really innovative digital products for companies like Ford and so forth. So it really makes sense to focus on, okay, here are all the things that you can gain by bringing, these digital products into your solution set. And we just kind of were okay, let's just take a note of that because that makes an assumption here. And the second thing that we did is we went out there and talked to people. So this is going out there and talking to users. And one thing that we noticed that was really interesting was that these people sounded really, really risk averse. So these are kind of CIOs, et cetera, at large Fortune 500 companies. And they talked continuously about how they've tried to bring solutions like this into their company, and it's failed horribly, and so they're very risk averse. And so for us, that was basically a red flag. Then another thing that we probed was the competitive landscape. So if these guys didn't exist, what would you do? And they brought up the, McKinsey's, et cetera. And to us, that was another red flag because we know nobody's going to get fired for hiring McKinsey. You will just pay, several $1,000,000, et cetera. So those were the things that we wanted to like really probe. So in the context of behavioral science, one insight that we had from this call that we wanted to understand is this idea that as humans, we tend to feel losses about twice as much as gains. So think of it this way: losing $100 out of your pocket walking down the street is about twice as painful as finding $100. Now, how does that translate in a B2B context and in terms of the messaging? We wanted to understand, is this audience more prevention focused, i.e., are they trying to buy these solutions to prevent something negative, or thinking about what does this product protect me from? Or are they more promotion focused? Are they gain focused? Or are they trying to figure out how do we achieve more? We knew that their marketing and how they were presenting themselves was very promotion oriented. In our qualitative research, talking to people, we'd noticed that they sound very prevention oriented. But as behavioral scientists, one thing that's really important to us is, if I ask you today, what are you going to eat tomorrow? Would you eat a salad or a burger? You'll say a salad. And then when tomorrow comes, you might eat a burger. So we're human. So what's really important to us is that we actually measure what happens in real life. So we're not just relying on a bunch of interviews with a bunch of people telling us something. We want to understand at scale what happens, because we're trying to grow at scale. And so what we ended up doing is we went on LinkedIn, and I'll explain one more behavioral science principle before I go into the experiments. The other behavioral science principle that we wanted to probe was this idea called relative choices or relativity. And the general idea is that as humans, we have a really hard time in making our decisions in a vacuum. This becomes critically important if we have, especially a new solution that we're bringing, a new technology solution that we're bringing to the market, because the people on the other side have really no frame of reference. And so it's really important for us to give them a frame of reference. You might have noticed this as good marketeers. Hopefully everybody knows the really famous Apple campaign that they did selling their Mac. So they basically personified the Mac and butted him up against the dork here. Microsoft. No offense to the people in the Seattle area, love Microsoft solutions. So anyhow, but largely what we were trying to understand is like, they're a lesser known brand. They're going up against the McKinsey's of the world. What's that impact, and how do we frame that solution? So we wanted to now understand at scale, what do we need to do? So we went on LinkedIn and we looked at their audience prospect base, so to speak, across like thousands of users, and we ran two sets of experiments. The first experiment was this kind of promotion versus prevention. Are people going to be more motivated by preventing losses, or are they going to be more motivated by gains? And so what you notice here is very subtle differences in the language that we use. We talk about how companies like Adidas, Microsoft, and Ford de-risk innovation, which is going to appeal to somebody that's prevention oriented. And then in contrast, we say, how do these companies beat the competition? So beating the competition is going to appeal to somebody that's more gain oriented. The other thing that we wanted to test was kind of this effect of the big consulting firm. So you can kind of see we did this relative choices. Basically, you work with a big consulting firm. It starts and ends with advice and a deck. You work with us. We basically take your solution from strategy all the way to bringing it to life. And as with any good experiment design, you always want to have a control condition. So this control condition was basically their best performing ad before we came along. And very common, it largely says kind of what they do. And so we wanted to see if any of these behavioral science frames work better. So again, we ran this across thousands of users because we want to see at scale what works. And what was really interesting is that at scale, that loss messaging worked better than the gain, and our relativity also worked better than our control. So now we knew, okay, this is the underlying motivation. This is how we need to start thinking about it, framing it relative to their competitors. So we were ready to kind of translate this into things like messaging and landing pages. And so I'm just showing you some parts of their messaging and landing pages. You can see how we go into this kind of loss orientation messaging. How do you de-risk innovation? How do you avoid revenue losses? How do you prevent lost time, waste money, damage to your reputation? All those things that we knew was going to appeal to somebody that's prevention oriented. And then we started kind of creating that contrast between them and the larger consulting firms. And then ultimately the real test is, okay, we do all of this work. Can it help us actually generate more leads? So we basically went back on LinkedIn, and we also looked at paid search and worked with our partners there and ran a trial for 3 months to see if we can generate leads. The good news is that we were able to generate a good number of leads, and these are enterprise leads. And so ultimately, this became the foundation for the campaigns that they ran for the year to come.